attendre encore juste une minute et nous allons commencer. Just 1 minute and we will start. Ok, je pense que pouvons commencer car nous avons déjà quelques participants déjà présents et pour pas prendre de retard. Donc, bienvenue à tous dans cette série de webinaires sur la cible 3 du cadre mondial. Donc, comme vous le savez, cet événement fait suite au forum régional d'échange de connaissances qui a été organisé par l'UNEP-WCMC et le WWF Gabon à Libreville au Gabon l'année dernière. Tout d'abord, next slide, please. Tout d'abord, quelques éléments logistiques. La session est à la fois donc à une interprétation simultanée en français, en espagnol et en anglais. Donc, pour choisir la langue qui vous correspond, vous pouvez cliquer sur le petit globe en bas, interprétation, et donc choisir la langue entre l'anglais, le français et l'espagnol. Prochaine, voilà. Ce webinaire est enregistré et il sera téléchargé sur la chaîne YouTube de l'UNEP-WCMC, donc vous pourrez aussi y accéder plus tard. Pour l'instant, vos micros sont en mode silencieux ainsi que votre caméra pendant toute la durée de la présentation. Mais bien sûr, à la fin de la présentation, nous vous inviterons à poser des questions. Donc, soit en utilisant la fonction Q&A qui est en bas de votre écran, soit en utilisant le chat ou en levant la main directement pour poser votre question. Si vous avez un problème technique, n'hésitez pas à envoyer un message direct à ma collègue Laura Mac qui est avec nous de notre équipe événement via le chat. Donc, tout d'abord, une petite diapo pour rappeler qui nous sommes. Nous sommes le Centre de suivi de conservation de la nature du Programme des Nations Unies pour l'environnement, qui est un centre global d'excellence sur la biodiversité et sur la contribution de la nature à la société et à l'économie. Nous travaillons à l'interface entre la science, les politiques et la mise en pratique afin de faire face à la crise globale de la nature et à soutenir une transition vers un futur plus durable, à la fois pour l'homme et pour la planète. Next slide. Donc, ce webinaire fait partie donc d'une série de 3. On a déjà eu un webinaire sur comment est-ce que les AMSES et les autres approches de conservation basées sur les aires peuvent être financées de manière durable. Vous pouvez toujours trouver le webinaire sur notre chaîne YouTube si vous voulez le consulter. Donc maintenant, on va parler comment intégrer les savoirs traditionnels dans les cadres de suivi mondiaux de la biodiversité. Et finalement, on aura aussi un troisième webinaire qui est déjà prévu le 20 février sur comment identifier et reconnaître les APAC et les AMSES et les intégrer dans une approche basée sur les droits. Next slide. Donc, au cours de ce webinaire, on va parler de comment est-ce que les savoirs traditionnels peuvent être intégrés dans les cadres de suivi de la biodiversité. Et pour cela, je suis ravie d'accueillir notre conférencière principale, Madame Jennifer Corpus. Donc, quelques mots sur Jennifer. Next slide, please. Donc, Jennifer est une femme autochtone du peuple Kankanev Igorot des Philippines. Elle participe depuis 2005 aux réunions de la CBD dans le cadre du Forum international autochtone sur la biodiversité. Au niveau national, elle travaille avec les peuples autochtones dans leurs territoires ou domaines ancestraux afin de sécuriser les droits fonciers formels et coutumiers, améliorer la gouvernance de la biodiversité et maintenir et transmettre les savoirs traditionnels. Jennifer a participé au processus qui a conduit à l'adoption du cadre mondial de la biodiversité et elle travaille désormais à soutenir la mise en œuvre efficace de ce cadre, à la fois par le biais de son travail avec la CBD et de son nouvel organe subsidiaire sur l'article 8J, aussi bien donc au niveau mondial qu'au niveau national. Lors de la première réunion historique du SB 8J, elle a d'ailleurs co-présidé le groupe sur les lignes directrices pour la conservation des territoires autochtones et traditionnels. Donc sans plus attendre, je remercie encore Jennifer Corpus d'avoir accepté d'être notre conférencière et je lui donne sans plus attendre donc la parole. À vous, Jennifer.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. Um, Today, I will be talking about the monitoring framework and with the perspective of identifying within the monitoring framework, how we can better integrate traditional knowledge. So apologies if we are repeating, if I'm going to be repeating some of the things that were already presented in the earlier webinars. I know this is part of a series, but nonetheless, I'll try to go through this initial slides quite quickly. Okay, so the monitoring framework was adopted at the same time as the Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted in COP15. The framework includes a set of headline, component, and complementary and binary indicators in its Annex 1, and it encourages the use of both national and subnational indicators. As part of the decision, it urges parties to recognize and support community-based monitoring and information systems, as well as citizen science, in the monitoring and implementation of the GBF. There was an ATEG established at COP15, and during the biennium between COPs, they conducted work to further refine the indicators. And at COP16 in Cali, there were technical updates adopted. Okay. The decision itself also invites the ad hoc open-ended working group on Article 8J and related provisions to continue the development of and operationalization of indicators related to traditional knowledge and indigenous peoples and local communities. So we go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. And what are these indicators? First, of course, we have the headline indicator, which is the highest level, and it aims to capture the overall scope of a particular goal or target. And it is mandatory for parties to report on these indicators. In addition to the indicator itself, there is a requirement to disaggregate these, well, not really a requirement, but in many instances, these headline indicators can be disaggregated or divided into different categories to provide more detail as needed. There are also questions with, well, yes or no or partial answers called binary indicators. And it's meant to have a quick count of the number of countries that have undertaken certain actions or activities. And again, this is also, like the headline indicator, mandatory for parties to use. Then we have component indicators and complementary indicators, both of which are not mandatory, but parties can select which ones to use and which ones are relevant to their context. Okay, next slide. And in this regard, there are indicators on traditional knowledge. And these indicators are used because they are, in a way, proxy indicators for ecosystem health within territories of indigenous peoples and local communities. The first indicator, the first TK indicator, is the status and trends of linguistic diversity and numbers of speakers of indigenous languages. And this follows from the observation that biological diversity is quite closely linked with cultural diversity. And the way that you measure cultural diversity is, well, a simple way to measure cultural diversity is the trends in linguistic diversity. Then you have the second TK indicator, which is the status and trends in the practice of traditional occupations. And the assumption here is that traditional occupations are those which are practiced by indigenous peoples and local communities in a way that is very closely connected to the ecosystem. The third TK indicator is the status and trends in land use change and land tenure in the traditional territories of indigenous peoples and local communities. Many scientific papers have been published. There is ample scientific evidence showing that land with land tenure security is better protected and richer in biological diversity. And then finally, the fourth TK indicator is the trends in which traditional knowledge and practices are respected through their full integration, safeguards, and the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples and local communities in the national implementation of the strategic plan. So these are the four TK indicators. Next slide. And the idea is that these four indicators would be fully would be further developed by the subsidiary body on Article 8J, alongside the implementation of the monitoring framework by the SUBSTA, subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice. So the four TK indicators feed into the headline, binary, component, and complementary indicators. And the method by which, ideally, the TK indicators and other indicators would be collected within indigenous territories is through community-based monitoring and information systems. There are some examples that are existing, such as the Indigenous Navigator Initiative and the local biodiversity outlooks, as well as human rights-based approach monitoring, which is something that is carried out by the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. So there are links between the TK indicators and the indicators under the monitoring framework of the KM-GBF. Next slide. Now, looking at the monitoring framework itself, the TK indicators are embedded in several different targets of the in the monitoring framework of several different targets of the KM-GBF. For instance, we have indicator number 9.2 under target 9, which is on sustainable use of biological diversity, wherein you can see it includes percentage of the population that practice their traditional occupations, which is expected to be disaggregated by indigenous peoples and local communities, by gender, by age category, and so forth. Okay, so that's one example where you can find the traditional knowledge indicator. Next. There are also binary indicators under target 9. And these are the questions that you can find under the binary indicators. And 9.5 has the question, does your country have legal instruments or other policy frameworks to protect and encourage the customary sustainable use of biodiversity by indigenous peoples and local communities? For example, the Plan of Action on Customary Sustainable Use of Biological Diversity, or other relevant initiatives. And then, because it's a binary indicator, it's not they don't expect a paragraph form response. You will choose between the answers no, under development, partially, fully, or not applicable. Okay, next. Target 22 is the main target on indigenous people's right to lands, territories, and resources, but it also has several other components, which includes access to justice and information, participation, and the protection of environmental rights defenders. And this is an earlier version, but now after a COP16, it was this particular indicator was unbracketed. So the headline indicator for Target 22 is land use change and land tenure in the traditional territories of indigenous peoples and local communities. So this is highly relevant to indicator 9.2 is also highly relevant to Target 22. And there is an expectation of disaggregation by indigenous peoples, by indigenous and traditional territories, and governance of all these indicators are relevant to Target 22. Okay. And then you have 22B, which is the number of countries taking action towards participation, full and effective participation of indigenous peoples and local communities. You can also see, because the part of the indicator is the protection of environmental rights defenders, one component indicator is the number of verified cases of killings and other attacks against environmental and human rights defenders. And of course, the expectation is that that should be as low as possible if we're talking about protection. The other component indicators here are the participation indicator, as well as the index of linguistic diversity, which are all the TK indicators that were specified earlier. Next slide. And then, of course, you have this binary indicators, which are also reflecting the four TK indicators. It's on participation, respect for rights and culture, ensuring the full protection of environmental defenders, public access to information, access to justice, and the question on whether there are operational frameworks and mechanisms related to policy, legislative, and administrative frameworks listed under question 22.1. So that's the binary indicators that reflect the 4 TK indicators. Next slide. As stated earlier, there is the option for the headline indicators to be disaggregated, and we can see here under Goal A, where we have the headline indicator of the red list of ecosystems, there is disaggregation, which is optional, where we disaggregate by indigenous and traditional territory. Next. And same with A.2, indicator A.2, which is the extent of natural ecosystems. There is an optional disaggregation by indigenous and traditional territories. Next. And then again, disaggregation under B, which is the sustainable use goal of the framework. So it's services provided by ecosystems, and again, disaggregated by indigenous and traditional territories. Next slide. Then on access and benefit sharing, you have Goal C, and there is an optional disaggregation for both monetary and non-monetary benefits received by indigenous peoples and local communities. Next slide. On restoration, which is Target 2, the headline indicator is the area under restoration, and there is an optional disaggregation by indigenous and traditional territories. Next slide. Target 3, which is the area-based conservation target. The headline indicator is the coverage of protected areas and OECMs, and the optional disaggregation is by governance type, as well as by indigenous and traditional territories. Next. And we have target 10 on the proportion of agricultural area under productive and sustainable agriculture, as well as the progress towards sustainable forest management. Again, we have the same disaggregation. Next slide. And target 21 on the basis for biodiversity decision making. And it includes an indicator on biodiversity information for the GBF. And as a component indicator, it includes the participation, the TK indicator on participation, as well as on linguistic diversity. We go to the next slide. In summary, the key gains for Indigenous peoples and local communities in the monitoring framework are the headline indicator and the binary indicator under targets 22 and 9. And on ABS, access and benefit sharing, goal C and target 13 looks at monetary and non-monetary benefits, as well as you could see in the previous slides, there are many headline indicators that can be disaggregated by indigenous and traditional territories. And next slide. Answering the question on how traditional knowledge can be better integrated into biodiversity monitoring frameworks, we turn back to the particular paragraph of the decision adopting the monitoring framework, which encourages the use of community-based monitoring and information systems. So, as I mentioned earlier, there is the Indigenous Navigator project, wherein indigenous peoples and local communities are trained on how to monitor the state of the ecosystem within their territories. And in this process, they are encouraged to look at culturally relevant indicators, so cultural keystone species and so forth. Indigenous peoples and local communities themselves do the monitoring under this approach. And an example that we have are Indigenous Guardians programs in Canada and Australia. And the idea here is that Indigenous peoples, as part of their culture and their governance, have within their communities persons assigned to monitor the territory. And what happens here within the Indigenous Guardians program is that the government itself has set up a program where they identify these indigenous rangers, if it's within a protected area, or guardians who have the obligation to do the surveillance and monitoring within the territory so that they can report on the changes, both related to climate change and related to the state of biological diversity within the territory. This was later adopted in Australia, which now also has an Indigenous Guardians program. There are also many examples in countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, wherein the indigenous rangers or indigenous forest guardians are deputized by the government to do the monitoring and surveillance so that they can report. They can, so to speak, have their ear on the ground, and they are able to report to the government and alert the government if there are instances where there are changes in climate, the state of the climate, or the state of biodiversity. And of course, the TK indicators, as you can see, are fully embedded in the different targets and goals of the GBF. And the use of the TK indicators here, in the case of targets 22 and 9, are mandatory. And in the other cases, they are complementary indicators, so they are not mandatory, but they can be used in order to enhance the monitoring of the status of biodiversity. And as I said earlier, there are opportunities for indigenous peoples and local communities themselves to identify the relevant indicators or that they use to monitor the state of their environment. And an example is the cultural keystone species. Next slide. Oh, I think this is the end of it. So thank you very much. I hope that was good for an initial presentation, and I look forward to the interaction later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for the presentation and for really providing very clearly all the details of the monitoring framework and how traditional knowledge can be embedded into that framework, and also for all the examples you provided. I don't know if there are spontaneous questions or comments from the participants. If not, I would also be curious to know if some participants want to tell us a bit about whether they've done some community-based monitoring in their country and if they can share their experience, or if not, why not, and if they think that would be something interesting to do. But I leave the floor to participants for questions or comments. Eugène, vous avez la parole.
Thanks, Elise. You hear me?
Oui, vous pouvez parler en français ou en anglais comme vous préférez.
Bien, je continue en français. Bien, première chose, merci pour la présentation. Elle était très, très intéressante et très instructive. Je voulais qu'elle explique bien community-based monitoring parce qu'en fait, je pense que c'est cela le nœud, un aspect très important. Et s'il y a des exemples aussi. Hein. Merci.
Merci Eugène pour la question. Peut-être alors je pourrais demander à Jennifer si elle peut approfondir un peu ces exemples. If you could just maybe give us a bit more details on the examples you mentioned.
Yes, thank you. Could you summarize the question? I was a little bit distracted by the background noise. Elise?
Yeah, I think Eugène was asking about the examples you gave. So perhaps if you could, just expand a little bit more on these examples and how it was done, and
Yes.
that would be useful, I think, to have some more details on these cases
Yes.
where this has been done.
Thank you very much. Okay, so for community-based monitoring and information systems, as I said, there is a system of the local biodiversity outlooks, which is a companion publication to the global biodiversity outlooks. And as we know, the GBO aggregates the different national reports. However, at some point, we noticed we tracked the national reports, and despite efforts of indigenous peoples in the different countries to participate in the process of formulating, of writing the national reports, there was poor reflection of the contributions and the actions of indigenous peoples in the national reports. That's why the idea of the local biodiversity outlooks was born. And the idea there was that they would, people in the local level, indigenous peoples and local communities, would do their own reporting. So it's not a national report as such, but it's a local report, and it would be aggregated through the local biodiversity outlooks. In addition, there are several initiatives wherein community enumerators are trained through the Indigenous Navigator Initiative. So different modules were developed, and in this case, for the GBF, there was biodiversity module that was developed. In the case of the previous strategic plan, there was a module developed to expand on the traditional knowledge indicators. So what happened was the usually young indigenous persons were trained on the questionnaire for the indigenous navigator. And they were the ones that went out and walked around in the forests, in the community, and answered the questions based on their observations within the community. So that was the idea. Here in my country, in the Philippines, this is accepted as an approach. So we have many communities here that that have young indigenous enumerators or survey implementers who were trained and who go regularly to the territory. They go around and they monitor and provide reports, both to their governance structure, their indigenous political system, and to the government. I think at the moment there are, I'm not sure of the number, but the consortium has probably about 30 countries now in Africa, Asia, and Latin America where that is being implemented. And the hope is that this would expand so that there is information coming from the community itself, from individuals within the community who are doing the monitoring.
Sorry, I just realized I was muted. I was just saying thanks for explaining how this is being done and giving some more details on how this can work. I saw there was another hand up, but now, oh, thanks for sharing also the link in the chat, indigenousnavigator.org. Carolina has her hand up.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Hello, Jennifer. Thank you for running through the indicators in the monitoring framework. Much appreciated. The question I have links to the previous one and how you're explaining that some individuals and communities are engaging in learning how to do it and what to collect. I think I was kind of interested in learning how the communities are buying in the need to monitor and how they are motivated to do that, because we are very kind of a niche around the CBD and these reporting needs. We understand, but of course this is not familiar for. I mean, I tell these things to my sister and they say, what? So it's a very niche thing. So how are these communities buying in, seeing the needs and contributing? So I would be interested to learn that if you have some feedback on that. Thanks.
Well, usually the motivation is for visibility. So whenever we approach communities and ask them to be part of one of the communities that implements the Indigenous Navigator to do their own monitoring, of course, number one, they're motivated by wanting for their efforts to become visible, and then for the efforts to be recognized. For instance, through potentially some resources that could support monitoring, or the realization that the actions on the ground are delivering good benefits, and the hope is that they would be duly recognized and duly supported through technical or financial support. So that's one motivation, and the other motivation is strengthening of the governance. I mean, for the community itself, there is the desire to strengthen the governance and also strengthen the participation of young people, because one of the difficulties that many indigenous communities face is that the young people are not as engaged anymore. So there are not many opportunities to pass on traditional knowledge. So within the communities, they become interested when they realize that it's an opportunity for the young people to learn more about the traditional knowledge that they have. Then, of course, there's in a way, the negative motivator, where here in the Philippines, in my particular experience, I would say that there are places where the government has taken over previously indigenous territory, and we've seen the degradation, no? Because now, when the governance of a certain area passes from the people, the local community or the indigenous peoples, and goes to the government, suddenly others look at it as an opportunity to, because it's no longer community governed, it's government, it's in a way governed by the government and fenced by the government. It becomes an opportunity for, economic activity and so forth, especially if there's weak enforcement. So the buy-in is motivated by, not wanting to see further degradation of the territory and further degradation of the traditional governance of indigenous peoples. I know that's still a little bit niche, but I think it's quite powerful when you are able to demonstrate, the contributions of traditional knowledge to conserving biodiversity. And, it's an important first step. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can I just ask before I give the floor to the next question about young people? Why do you think they are much less engaged than older people?
Well, in our case, education, but also connectivity, and it's a common problem. So now many indigenous territories are consciously trying to address this, because now when the people in the territory start to go to the mainstream schools and start to be educated, then they become less interested, no? And if they have cell phones, connectivity, and so forth, they become less interested. So now we're seeing a lot of programs to bring back the indigenous young people, and they're quite successful. And it's amazing what the kind of creativity we see among these young people now.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Next question is from Jasmine, please.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Jennifer. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was, a really, really helpful presentation, and great to come together to discuss these important indicators that I know you've been key in making sure are in the monitoring framework as well. I guess I would be interested to have some more, if you have them, examples of how countries are applying these indicators and reporting on these indicators at the national level, but particularly where there may, if you could highlight some good practices in terms of how they have been appropriately engaging indigenous peoples and local communities in the application of these indicators. Thank you.
Okay, I will again use the country where I'm from, because it's what I'm most familiar with. But when during the sixth national report, the government of the Philippines was able to meet its target that it set under the previous strategic plan. And the reason for this was because they decided to recognize indigenous peoples' conserved territories and areas. Okay. And as part of the push for recognition of these territories and areas, they had to engage with indigenous peoples, and now and they had to kind of develop a map at the national level where they would identify where indigenous territories are, and also looking at how they overlap with protected areas and so forth. So because of that information that they were able to establish, they embarked on a process to expand, revise the National Integrated Protected Areas Act. And there are now several provisions there that recognize that it's better if indigenous peoples are part of the governance of these areas, these protected areas that are overlapping with indigenous territories. And then because the governance of indigenous peoples has been recognized over these areas, they also become part of the monitoring. So they, as a first step, it was important to recognize that these territories are conserved by indigenous peoples. And then it followed that because they were recognized as the entities that conserve and protect these areas, they were also given the opportunity to report on other things on the indicator. And of course, the problem is that the other TK indicators are not so well established yet. We don't know we have not clearly identified who the repository is and what the methodology is for collecting the other TK indicators other than the land tenure indicators. So it was quite easy to report on the land tenure indicator. And I think many countries have done so. Colombia is another example. However, there needs to be further development of the methodology for the other TK indicators. There is good progress this decade because it's been recognized as the decade for indigenous languages. And there is progress within the United Nations system and at national level to develop, how you monitor this index of linguistic diversity. So there's progress there. But for traditional occupations, it's a little bit of a struggle still to get reporting on that indicator. So there's willingness, but the structure is not quite there yet.
Thank you, Jennifer, for all these details. Are there any more questions? Can't see any questions in the Q&A or online.
There's a question
Alex.
from Alex. Yeah.
Oui, bonjour tout le monde. Je suis M. Alex de l'ANAPAC au niveau de la République démocratique du Congo. Merci à Jennifer pour cette présentation en tout cas très bien faite. J'avais seulement quelques préoccupations là. Et c'est en lien avec est-ce que réellement ces indicateurs qui sont du cadre spécifiquement pour le cadre mondial de la biodiversité, en tout cas, sont en cohérence avec, parce que je sais que chaque pays a pu élaborer son SPAN B, ou la stratégie et plan d'action nationaux de la biodiversité, où ils ont essayé un peu de revoir certains objectifs ou actualiser certains objectifs. Est-ce que ces indicateurs, tels que décrits dans le cadre mondial de la biodiversité, en tout cas sont en cohérence avec les indicateurs, par exemple, pays, parce que chaque pays maintenant essaye un peu d'adapter ces indicateurs conformément à la réalité de chaque pays. Et la deuxième question que j'avais à poser, c'était celle de savoir est-ce que du point de vue réalité ou de la réalité qui existe, il peut être vérifiable comment dirais-je, de mesurer, par exemple, le savoir traditionnel que détiennent les communautés. Est-ce que c'est possible vraiment de mesurer ça? Merci beaucoup.
Merci, merci Alex. Donc, deux questions. La première sur... oh, sorry, I wanted to speak in English to help a little bit with the questions. So yeah, your first questions was about whether the GBF indicators are harmonized with the national level indicators and with the objectives of the NBSAPs. And the second question is actually an interesting and difficult one probably, is how can we possibly measure traditional knowledge?
Yes, exactly. That's it's quite complicated to measure traditional knowledge. But taking on the first question, the idea here, well, we are about to go. In fact, in a week or so, we are going to Rome for the subsidiary body on implementation, SBI. And one of the key agenda items there is the planning, monitoring, reporting, and review, PMRR. And it's the idea is that They would analyze the progress of countries in updating their NBSAPs and submitting national targets. Now, the innovation here with the KMGBF is that there are requirements for, in a way requirements, but strong guidance for the development of national targets, okay? So the GBF identifies global targets, and the expectation is that the countries will identify their national targets in such a way that they contribute to the global targets. So there are 144 countries that have submitted their national targets, and about 60 that have submitted their updated NBSAPs. And based on the analysis, they are quite aligned with the GBF targets, and they are quite, however, there is unevenness in the targets where, the GBF targets where national targets are corresponding. Okay, so this means that the other innovation in the GBF is that there's this system of headline indicators. So if in the past the governments can pick and choose which indicators they will be reporting against, now there are mandatory indicators, which are the headline indicators and the binary indicators. And as I said earlier, under Target 22 and Target 9, the TK indicators themselves are included as a headline or binary indicator. So it's mandatory to report. Now, it's like looking at an elephant, the blind people looking at an elephant and then touching the different parts. So it's only, the TK indicators that I presented, the 4, are just touching on different parts of the elephant, no? So they measure parts of traditional knowledge, but they don't show you the full status of traditional knowledge. So if you look at the Indigenous Navigator and its biodiversity module, it has quite a more extensive way of crafting, formulating its questions so that we get a fuller picture of how, what the level of vitality is of traditional knowledge within the communities. But unfortunately, the world is very complex and the contexts are very different. And when we have the monitoring framework, we have in a way to standardize. And so it's impossible to have a full measure of traditional knowledge. But, the 4 that were presented and that were accepted by the CBD give you quite a good idea already of how, what the status of traditional knowledge is. So we hope it can improve in the future, but for now, this is what we have.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer. I hope that answers your complicated question, Alex, about measuring traditional knowledge, which obviously is quite complicated. And thanks for all the clarification, Jennifer, on the indicators and how that works. Are there any other questions or comments or suggestions? One last opportunity, otherwise we will finish now. Well, it looks like there aren't any more questions, so thank you a lot again, Jennifer, for being our main speaker and for this super interesting webinar. I would have hoped for even more participants than we had today, but it is recorded, so we will share it with all participants who were not able to make it today, and this way we'll reach out to more people in the group. So again, yeah. Many thanks for everybody to be here, and many thanks, Jennifer, for being our speaker today. Have a good evening or morning, wherever you are. Thank you. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.